This might just be the most important video I've ever made, or ever will make. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Neptunia series. Just look at what I'm wearing. It's purple! So, the Neptunia franchise for many years has teetered on the cusp of obscurity, straddling the line between niche and slightly less niche, at least among fans of Japanese games. It's not too unlikely that an avid gamer would be able to at least recognize Neptune as that funny purple girl who sometimes shows up in the anime section of Steam sales, even if they haven't personally played any of the games. And since context is important, this video is largely told through a Western perspective, since the Nep experience varies largely between Japan and, well, not Japan. So, first things first, a brief primer on the series for those less familiar. The core Neptunia games are a series of turn-based RPGs by the Japanese studio Compileheart. Plot centers around four lovable and distinctly colored girls, who lead nations that loosely represent four real-world game companies, being Sega, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony. So the four nations are in the midst of what is referred to as a console war, a reference to the real-world rivalry between the companies. And from there, the plot usually goes on to have the four girls working together to defeat a more dangerous looming threat, such as R4, the evil anthropomorphized representation of digital piracy. Like many long-running RPG series, the games can be split into two categories: a mainline series that generally stick to the core gameplay loop, and a bunch of spin-offs that are more loose with the genre. The mainline series itself can be further split into two continuities, being Hyperdimension Neptunia 1 and its various remakes as one timeline, and the somewhat confusingly named Hyperdimension Neptunia Mark II, Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory, and Megadimension Neptunia V2 as a separate trilogy. So technically the first game in the series is non-canon to the overarching continuity, but it's still valuable for establishing world building and characterization that stays mostly consistent between the games. So, with a quick introductory rundown out of the way, what makes this series so special? This question will be the crux of this segment as I speculate on the circumstances of an era long forgotten. If you look at the games from a bare minimum surface level, you might see a somewhat generic, relatively low-budget JRPG, and that spot analysis might not be entirely inaccurate. So maybe Neptunia doesn't boast cutting-edge graphics, the most compelling narratives, or even groundbreaking gameplay mechanics. What the franchise does have, however, is two important noteworthy factors. The first is an aggressive marketing and merchandising campaign, and the second is an abundance of soul. Soul is somewhat of a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot these days, so what is it that specifically makes Neptunia stand out from the other bargain bin RPGs of its time? It was somewhat of a perfect storm of factors that allowed Neptunia to truly shine in the West, being disproportionately popular for a Japanese game of its kind. While it was still relatively niche, it had a few aces up its sleeve, such as being one of the few true JRPGs available on PCs through Steam at the time. It's safe to assume that the frequent Steam sales giving deep discounts on the games has been a huge boon to its exposure in the West. It was also positioned as a killer app for the PS Vita. Hold your laughter. The PS Vita was a notoriously unpopular handheld, outside of Japan at least, but it did have a dedicated following, and the Hyperdimension Neptunia games had a fantastic attach rate for the Vita, about twice as high as the average attach rate for other games. So the pieces of the puzzle were in place, but did the games actually deliver? From a critical standpoint, not really. Most of the games scored middling reviews at best. But nonetheless, fans ate those games up like they were sweet pudding and came back for seconds. The Secret sauce was in the memorable and likable cast of characters, as well as the quirky and unique sense of humor that the script was absolutely riddled with. Nowadays, quippy dialogue and meta humor is kind of dime a dozen in video games. But if you look at the general landscape of media at the time of the early mid-2010s, when the Neptunia games first hit the scene, it becomes a little more clear how the unabashed ironic humor of Neptunia was able to catch on so quickly. Neptunia's script is famous for fourth wall breaks, lampshading points about the genre and the medium, and just being all around self-aware. Prior to the 2010s, games in general tended to be quite a bit more straightforward in how they were presented. Meta humor and the overall shift in tone for video games started to really take off around that time. It existed before, but a lot of the games released in this era really exemplify this point. We saw the releases of games such as Borderlands, Portal 2, and the explosive growth of indie games that had more freedom to reference popular culture and memes. So, it is of my opinion that Neptunia perfectly married this self-aware sense of humor in the character dialogue, with its story beats that, for the most part, were taken pretty seriously enough, resulting in sort of a self-contained straight man comedy duo act. Sticking the landing on this kind of dynamic can be tricky, but it's executed quite well overall. Neptunia knows exactly what kind of gamer would see and appreciate this kind of cover art, and is completely unashamed in giving them exactly what they would want. In essence, while I hesitate to say this so matter-of-factly, the generic gameplay and unspectacular graphics never really mattered too much in the end, when fans were meant to latch on to the characters first and foremost. So much effort was put into creating high-quality official artwork and promotional drawings of the cast, thanks largely in part to the absolutely sublime work of the artist Tsunako, as well as giving them distinct and fantastic voiceover performances, in both English and Japanese no less. Seriously, the English dub is so good it's even managed to sway some subtitle gamer fanatics.
Oh my, how lewd!
Making a character-driven game can be difficult. With so many strong personalities, they can clash if not handled gracefully. But it's also a fantastic way to set up the milking machine for a franchise, as evidenced very strongly in modern day by the success of gacha games. Even within the sphere of single-player RPGs though, putting emphasis on the characters has allowed something like the Persona series, with its social link and slice-of-life moments, to branch off into spin-offs and crossovers, while its sister series, Shin Megami Tensei, with its higher emphasis on intricate gameplay and more profound storytelling, is a bit more self-contained. Both styles are good, of course, but Neptunia falls definitely in the former camp. People care deeply for these characters. Merchandise, like figures and apparel, sell like hotcakes, much more than you might expect from a game of its caliber at least. Limited edition bundles always sell out in the West. Simply put, Nep's face sells. It's the magic formula to her game's success. So the next question to ponder is, where does the series go from there? Well, after the first 3 mainline games were put out and Nep was scientifically proven to be a success, all the stops were pulled out, and for the next few years there were no brakes on the Nep train. Spin-off after spin-off was pumped out, along with more ports and remakes of the original games. To be absolutely clear, these were not particularly high-effort productions. Producing Perfection was an idle simulator type game with very little actual gameplay. Action Unleashed was a button-mashy asset dump, and Mega Tagmention Blanc plus Neptune vs. Zombies. This is a terrible title, even among some of the word spaghetti titles the series is infamous for, on top of being a shameless reskin of Action Unleashed. Despite that, and despite the critical reception ranging from scathing to apathetic, the games went on to be relative successes in their own right. Producing Perfection, for instance, sold 30,000 copies in its first week in Japan, which was on par with main series releases at the time. The gameplay may have been shallow, but they were still able to provide your average Nep junkie with their much-needed fix. The characterization and interactions were mostly intact, so getting to experience new scenarios with the girls was always appreciated. This eventually culminated in the release of Mega Dimension Neptunia V2 in 2015. That is, Victory 2, as in the sequel to Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory, and the fourth game in the main series, and not VII, as in the Roman numeral 7. It was the final main series release, barring more updated re-releases, which released to the usual lukewarm reception and acceptable sales. Following 2015 though, the game releases started to slow down somewhat, with the PS Vita being dying hardware. There was more room to work with more powerful hardware, resulting in slightly more exciting spin-offs like Cyberdimension Neptunia, which featured higher quality graphics and open areas with slightly more complex combat systems. There's also Super Neptunia RPG, a side-scroller developed by a Canadian developer, Artisan Studios. Unfortunately, Super Neptunia RPG bombed both critically and commercially, selling only 11,000 copies in Japan on release, making it among the worst-selling Neptunia games of all time. Perhaps coincidentally, the era after Mega Dimension was somewhat of a turning point for the franchise. Releases for the games slowed down, but the quality was not improving either, as you might expect when more time is allotted between releases. The next spin-off game to release was Neptunia Virtual Stars, which was the second worst Neptunia game sales-wise at launch, only hitting about 12,000, and this time they didn't even have the excuse of outsourcing to a foreign publisher. The combination of Neptunia and virtual YouTubers seemed like a match made in heaven, and yet they somehow whiffed it. VTuber fans are notoriously some of the biggest simps known to mankind, but even they didn't want to buy this shameless cash grab, even if it did feature a 10-second clip of their Oshi. To be fair, the game launched right before virtual YouTubers really exploded into a global phenomenon, and they were not super prominently featured in the game, being more cameos rather than main characters. But still, Compile Heart had the licenses to use these characters, and they really let the golden goose slip away. I can only imagine how big a proper Hololive crossover RPG, for instance, might have been if it were released now, but that ship has long since sailed. And so the fans waited, hoping that Neptunia wouldn't slowly wither away and die as a shadow of its former self. There were a few crossover appearances, such as the Azure Lane event, but as far as major game launches go, it was mostly silent for quite some time. Then, in August 2020, a small spark of hope was ignited when the first confirmations of a new Neptunia game, coming for the soon-to-launch PlayStation 5 system, were teased, with more details confirmed to be coming soon after. This potentially groundbreaking turn for the series quickly turned to bitter disappointment when it turned out that it would just be an updated port of Rebirth 1, the updated port of the first Hyperdimension Neptunia. But this time with fishing! You can't have a JRPG without a fishing minigame. There was one thing this series has always been sorely lacking, it's fishing. Anyways, if it wasn't already, the writing on the wall for the decline of the series was showing more clearly than ever, even to those hooked up to the most powerful weapon-grade scopium dispensers. But to those outside of Japan, this so-called decline hit especially hard. The aforementioned stellar English dub, completely absent from Virtual Stars, even in Western releases. Somewhat understandable given the inclusion of real-world virtual YouTubers who, of course, only speak Japanese and, in some cases, the very rare elite language. But still disappointing all the same. It kinda reeks of an excuse to put less effort or a smaller budget into the Western port. The special anime OVA episode was also Japanese only, despite the Neptunia animation series having a full English dub in the past. And of course, Neptune's guest appearances in Senran Kagura Peach Beach Splash and the Azure Lane titles as well as her most recent game, Neptunia Cross Senran Kagura Ninja Wars, lacked any English voice work whatsoever, as those games have traditionally always been Japanese only. But for many fans who played in English, the English voices are essential pieces of the character's identity. When keeping these characters intact is so crucial to the overall formula of the franchise, alienating a large chunk of fans this way is always going to be somewhat bitter. Of course, Rie Tanaka does fantastic work, for sure, but it just isn't the same without Melissa Fawn doing Neptune and Purple Heart's voice, you know? But alas, it just can't be helped. Having to provide English voices to every Senran Kagura ninja who has never had one before would be a lot more localization work and contribute greatly to the cost of the project. While the dubbing industry has continued to expand and many RPGs are made with much more global presence in mind, Neptunia has unfortunately remained somewhat stagnant throughout the years in its practices. Of course, there is the harrowing possibility that the decline of the video games was too little too late. While the games haven't been doing as hot, merchandise continues to rake in the cash. Scale figures of Neptune get pumped out at a rate that would make way more alive video game series jealous. Seriously, why the heck aren't there more Granblue Fantasy scale figures and Android side games? You already got me by the throat, let me give you even more of my money. On top of that, a quick jaunt over to the Idea Factory International store page shows that a lot of the Neptunia related goods sell out fairly consistently. Special editions almost always sell out before or shortly after the launch of the game. Even in the West, where fanatically collecting merchandise isn't quite as big of a thing, it is fairly evident that NEP gets a lot of special treatment when it comes to quantity and variety of physical goodies. But with all this focus on merchandise, as well as the cast of Neptunia being relegated mostly to ports and crossovers for the past few years, outlook on this series is pretty bleak. It's easy these days to say that the games were never good, but at least fans had something to look forward to, even if it was just Neptune updating her knowledge of memes to the modern day, or another argument between Blanc and Vert over chess sizes. Amidst all the doom and gloom, there's not much left to do but wait and hope for something new to come along and break the downward spiral. Maybe the sales data from the recent games will be somewhat of a wake-up call to Compile Heart and reignite their passion as game developers, but that remains to be seen. One could make the argument that Neptunia, being a relic of its time, would be difficult to revive in today's day and age. Parody humor is judged a lot more critically these days, and while there would always be a market for cute girls doing cute things, it might be somewhat of a challenge for even an established franchise like Neptunia to find a solid foothold in today's turbulent video game market. Furthermore, the turn-based RPG gameplay formula has somewhat fallen out of favor after its brief resurgence. Many games are seeking to innovate. Even longtime traditionally turn-based RPGs like Pokemon and Trails are looking to incorporate more real-time elements into mainline titles. And of course, other classic RPG series like Final Fantasy and Tales of have found great success in fully embracing the action RPG genre. While fans clamor for a Neptunia 5 or Victory 3 or whatever, it's hard to say if something like that could even make a splash. Granted, it surely would be at least a cut above what we've been getting. So, what are some things they could do to inject life into Neptunia? I'm not a marketing expert or anything, and I wouldn't know for sure, so consider this more of a wish list segment, since the rational part of my brain knows that none of these will likely ever happen. First, obviously, would be a new mainline RPG to advance the continuity. I'm not sure where the story could go from where it left off, but with all the universe shifting shenanigans, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to pull a new big bad out of somewhere. Also, bringing spotlight to some of the side characters who've been neglected for years now, like Plutia, would be much appreciated. My ideal scenario would put the focus on the adult Neptune from V2. Her universe-jumping powers has a lot of potential to introduce new areas and mechanics to the game. I would also really like to see a social link mechanic like in Fire Emblem, to get some more one-on-one conversations between characters. especially those who might not normally interact in those kinds of situations. Moving on to the next generation of spin-offs, the one that immediately jumps to mind first is a fighting game. Whenever you have a bunch of good character designs but no idea what to do with them, making a fighting game is a great way to get mileage out of them. With recent games like Dragon Ball FighterZ, Guilty Gear Strive, and Granblue Fantasy Versus, there's been somewhat of a renaissance of the anime fighter genre. The wacky nature of Neptunia series with its unique special abilities and crazy power scalings would make each character feel right at home in a 2D fighting game. And if they really wanted to extract every last penny possible from an anime girl property, there's no better method than the gacha game. I know there was technically that Japan-only mobile game with the horrifying/arousing redesigns for a while, but I'm talking pulling out all the stops and making a full-on, globally available Hyperdimension Neptunia gacha. This would be the best way to justify the Action Unleashed style of gameplay in my opinion, as that kind of simplified action RPG has been proven effective with the advent of Genshin Impact. They could also do a turn-based RPG gacha, or even go back to the pseudo-idol raising simulator style, but simply being able to wail for Neptune and the crew would be enough to generate some big bucks, as long as they put some effort into the writing to make the Neptunia experience feel authentic. Honestly, a little shocked they haven't already tried this in some form. Finally, a Monster Hunter style co-op action game would be pretty neat. Narratively, the pieces are already pretty much in place, since a lot of the quests in the game involve going to a nation's guild to take requests to exterminate monsters. Scaling the monsters up and making the combat mechanics and enemy behaviors much more complex would make a fantastic premise for a game. They did somewhat scratch the surface of this with Cyberdimension Neptunia, which even had a co-op function, albeit a very watered down and barely functional one. Anyways, those are just some of the ideas I had knocking around. I want the series to prosper, of course, but as things are, it's pretty grim. Not having been excited for the series I loved for years just because I knew I was going to be disappointed, it's not a good feeling. Whether it's a series burnout or lack of creative ideas or simply misguided effort on the part of the developers, it's been a rough few years for the Neptunia series. And I admit, this analysis might have been overly harsh, but fans can take solace in that the series is not dead. It's just as likely that the current state of affairs is just some fumbling before they find the shot that does end up sticking the landing. Again, it comes down to waiting, and hoping. Well, that's my piece all said and done. If you have any stories about your experience with the Neptunia series, or ideas for the direction you'd like to see it take in the future, feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear the thoughts of other fans, or even people who just simply happen to experience the game at some point.